My husband told me that marrying me made his life harder. So I stopped being his wife. My husband Ryan and I had been married for 7 years when he said the words that changed everything. We were arguing about him forgetting our anniversary dinner reservation, and he exploded saying marrying me had made his life so much harder than when he was single. He said before me he could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and now he had to think about someone else all the time. He said having a wife was like having a second job he never asked for. He actually listed all the ways I'd made his life difficult. Having to text when he'd be late, having to consider my opinion on purchases, having to attend my work events, having to spend time with my family, having to remember dates and birthdays. He said single guys had it so much easier, and he envied his unmarried friends who had freedom. I asked if he wanted a divorce, and he said no, that was too much hassle. He just wanted me to stop making his life so complicated. So I decided to stop being his wife. Not legally, just practically. I stopped doing everything a wife would do. The next morning, I didn't make his coffee or pack his lunch like I'd done every day for 7 years. Ryan asked where his lunch was, and I said making it would complicate his life. I stopped doing his laundry, stopped picking up his dry cleaning, stopped making dinner. When he complained he had nothing clean to wear, I said washing his clothes would make his life harder since he'd have to be grateful. I stopped planning anything. His mother's birthday came and went without a card because remembering would have been too much pressure for him. His boss invited us to dinner and I didn't respond because coordinating schedules would complicate things. His friends asked why I never came out anymore, and I told them Ryan found having a wife around made everything harder. I stopped being emotional support. When he had a terrible day at work and wanted to vent, I said listening might make him feel obligated to ask about my day too, and that would be complicated. When he was sick, I didn't bring him medicine or soup because taking care of him might make him feel like he owed me care in return. I stopped handling household management. Bills went unpaid because I didn't want to burden him with financial discussions. The refrigerator stayed empty because grocery planning together would be too complex. The house got dirty because discussing chore division would make his life harder. When his brother asked why our house was a disaster, Ryan said I'd stopped cleaning, and his brother asked why Ryan couldn't clean his own house. Ryan started eating takeout every night, wearing wrinkled clothes to work, missing important dates. His coworkers noticed and asked if everything was okay at home. He said I'd stopped doing wife things, and his female coworker Helen said that sounded like he'd been relying on unpaid labor and was now experiencing normal adult responsibilities. His single friends he envied so much came over and saw the chaos. They said their places were clean and organized because they took care of themselves like adults. Ryan said it was different because he had a wife who should be doing these things. His friend Tony, who was actually single, said that was exactly the entitled attitude that would keep Ryan helpless forever. The breaking point was when Ryan's mother Dorothy came to stay for a week. She called a month ahead, and Ryan forgot to tell me because I usually handled his family visits. She showed up to a filthy house, no guest room prepared, no food in the refrigerator. Ryan frantically tried to clean while she stood there appalled. He begged me to help, and I said that would complicate his life with expectations. Dorothy asked what was going on, and Ryan said I'd stopped being a proper wife. Dorothy asked what that meant, and Ryan explained how I'd made his life harder with all my wife duties, so I'd stopped doing them. Dorothy stared at him, then asked if he was seriously complaining that having a partner who cooked, cleaned, and cared for him was making his life difficult. She asked if he knew what she'd gone through raising him alone after his father left, doing everything herself while working 2 jobs. She said Ryan had no idea what a hard life actually looked like. Dorothy spent her visit teaching Ryan basic life skills he'd never learned because I'd always done everything. She taught him to use the washing machine, to meal prep, to clean a bathroom. She was disgusted that her 35-year-old son couldn't function without a woman serving him. She told him his father had said the same thing about marriage being too hard right before abandoning them. While Dorothy taught Ryan to cook basic meals, she told me I should leave him. She said she'd failed as a mother raising a man who thought partnership was a burden. Ryan heard her and started crying. Ryan's voice cracked as he repeated that he didn't want to be like his father. I watched from the doorway while Dorothy folded her clothes into her suitcase with sharp, angry movements. She told him understanding wasn't enough, that I deserved better than promises made in panic. Ryan wiped his face with his sleeve and asked what he should do. Dorothy zipped her bag closed and said he needed to grow up and figure out how to be a real partner, not a child who needed his wife to mother him. She picked up her suitcase and walked past him without another word. The front door closed behind her and the house felt different in the silence she left behind. Ryan sat at the kitchen table surrounded by dirty dishes, crumpled takeout bags, and unopened mail. He stared at his hands and asked what he could do to fix this. I leaned against the counter and told him I didn't know if it could be fixed. The problem wasn't just the chores or the tasks I'd stopped doing. The problem was that he'd seen our entire partnership as a burden instead of something valuable. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then closed it and looked down. He nodded slowly and said nothing else. That night, Ryan grabbed a pillow and blanket without me saying anything. He walked to the couch and I heard him settling in as I climbed the stairs alone. I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling thinking about Dorothy's words. Part of me wanted to pack my own bag and leave like she had. Another part remembered the man I married 7 years ago, the one who used to laugh with me and hold my hand during movies. I wondered if that person still existed somewhere under all this mess, or if I'd been fooling myself this whole time. Morning light came through the bedroom window and I found Ryan standing in the kitchen looking like he hadn't slept. He'd tried to clean, but the dishes still had grease on them, and the counters felt sticky under my hand. The dishwasher door hung open with plates stacked wrong inside. He looked exhausted and lost, like a kid who'd tried his best and failed anyway. I didn't thank him or tell him he'd done it wrong. I just poured my coffee, grabbed my purse, and headed to work. My phone rang during lunch and Isla's name appeared on the screen. She asked where I'd been because she hadn't heard from me in weeks. I sat in my car in the parking lot and told her everything. About Ryan's comment, about me stopping all the wife duties, about Dorothy showing up and teaching her grown son how to use a washing machine. Isla got mad on my behalf and said Ryan sounded like a child who only cared when his mommy showed up to scold him. Her anger felt good, like someone finally understood how hurt I was. But it also made me wonder if I was being too soft by not calling a lawyer right away. I walked through the front door that evening and opened the refrigerator to find plastic containers lined up in rows. Each one had a label in Ryan's handwriting showing what Dorothy had taught him to make. Chicken and rice, pasta with sauce, simple stir-fry. The food looked basic but edible and he'd made enough for the whole week. Ryan appeared in the doorway and told me nervously that he'd followed all her instructions exactly. He said he wrote everything down so he wouldn't forget any steps. We sat across from each other at dinner eating the surprisingly decent chicken and rice. Ryan started apologizing again, and I held up my hand to stop him. I told him I didn't want apologies right now. What I wanted was to see real effort over time, not panic-driven promises made because his mother had yelled at him. He looked hurt but nodded and said that made sense. We ate the rest of the meal in silence. The next few days created a strange new pattern in our house. Ryan did laundry, and his white shirts came out pink because he'd mixed them with a red towel. He scrubbed the bathroom but left streaks all over the mirror and soap scum in the corners. He went grocery shopping with a list and came home missing half the things we actually needed. I watched him struggle and mess up and try again. Every time I wanted to step in and show him the right way or criticize what he'd done wrong, I bit my tongue and walked away. He had to learn this himself. The doorbell rang on a Wednesday afternoon and I opened it to find Helen from Ryan's office holding a folder of documents. She apologized for dropping by unannounced but said Ryan had left these at work. I invited her in and heard sounds from the bathroom. Helen walked down the hall and stopped in the doorway. Ryan was on his hands and knees scrubbing the bathtub with his phone propped on the toilet playing a YouTube tutorial. Helen caught my eye and gave me an approving nod before leaving. I realized then that other people were watching to see if his change was real or just a show he was putting on. 2 weeks after Dorothy left, Ryan's brother called my phone instead of his. He asked if everything was okay because Ryan had seemed really shaken during their last conversation. I told him honestly that we were figuring things out and that Ryan was learning what adult partnership actually required. His brother got quiet for a moment, then admitted he'd always thought Ryan had it too easy with me doing everything. He said his own wife had told him the same thing after hearing about our situation. I thanked him for checking in and hung up wondering how many people had noticed Ryan's entitled attitude over the years, but never said anything. I found Michelle Brand's office on a Thursday morning after searching online for therapists who specialized in marriage problems. The waiting room had soft gray couches and magazines nobody ever read, and I filled out forms asking about my mental health history and what brought me there. Michelle was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with glasses and a calm way of looking at me that made me feel like she actually wanted to hear what I had to say. I told her about Ryan's comment that marriage made his life harder, about how I'd stopped doing everything, about Dorothy's visit and Ryan's breakdown. She listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, and when I finished, she asked me what I actually wanted from my marriage. The question stopped me cold because I realized I'd been so focused on what I didn't want that I hadn't thought about what I did want. I didn't want to be taken for granted, didn't want to be seen as a burden, didn't want to do everything alone. But what did I actually want? Michelle helped me understand that before I could evaluate whether Ryan's efforts were real, I needed to figure out my own needs. She gave me homework to write down what a good partnership would look like to me, not what it shouldn't be, but what it should be. That evening, Ryan asked if we could talk about our marriage, and my whole body tensed up because I was tired of the same conversation. But I agreed and set ground rules first. He had to listen without getting defensive, without making excuses, without turning it around on me. He nodded and sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded like he was bracing himself. I told him that when he said marriage made his life harder, it revealed something I'd been trying not to see for years. He saw me as an obligation instead of a partner he chose. Every single thing he'd listed as a burden: texting when he'd be late, considering my opinion, attending my work events, spending time with my family, remembering dates. Those were all me loving him through actions. And he took it all for granted like it was some job I was supposed to do instead of care I was choosing to give. He started crying again, tears running down his face while he tried to speak. He admitted he never thought about it that way, that he'd just been comparing his life to his single friends without considering what he'd be losing. I told him that was exactly the problem, because he valued his friend's freedom more than our partnership. He asked how he could show me he valued what we have, and I said I didn't know yet, but time would tell. The conversation left us both exhausted, sitting in silence at opposite ends of the table. The following week, Ryan kept up with the household tasks, and I watched him closely to see if the effort would fade. His laundry stopped coming out pink because he'd learned to separate colors properly. His bathroom cleaning became more thorough. No more streaks on the mirror or soap scum in the corners. He started checking the grocery list twice before shopping, and came home with everything we actually needed. The improvements were small, but they were consistent, and that mattered more than if he'd suddenly become perfect. I noticed he was developing routines, doing laundry on Wednesdays, cleaning the bathroom on Saturdays, grocery shopping on Sundays. He'd set phone reminders so he wouldn't forget, and sometimes I'd hear the alarm go off and watch him stop whatever he was doing to handle the task. It was like watching someone learn a new language through repetition and practice. I came home one day to find a handyman's truck in our driveway, and Ryan standing in the kitchen looking sheepish. He explained that he'd called someone to fix things around the house that had been broken for months, things I'd asked him to handle repeatedly before. The leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that dripped constantly, the loose cabinet door that hung crooked and wouldn't close right, the broken closet shelf that had collapsed under the weight of our winter clothes. The handyman was working through the list, and Ryan admitted he'd been ignoring my requests because he didn't see household maintenance as his responsibility. He thought if something broke, I would either fix it myself or nag him enough that he'd eventually deal with it. Now he understood that ignoring these things meant I had to live with broken stuff or do everything myself. The handyman finished and handed Ryan the bill, and I saw him wince at the cost, but he paid it without complaining. Ryan's friend Tony came over for a beer on Saturday afternoon, and they sat in the backyard while I was inside folding laundry. I could hear them talking through the open window, their voices carrying across the yard. Tony asked how things were going with the marriage situation, and Ryan laughed, but it sounded tired. He admitted it was humbling to realize how much he didn't know about running his own life. Tony told him honestly that he seemed more like an actual adult now instead of a teenager with a wife who acted like his mom. Ryan didn't argue, just said yeah, that was probably accurate. They talked about Tony's girlfriend and how they split everything equally, and Ryan asked questions about how they decided who did what. Tony explained they just talked about it like adults, and figured out what made sense based on their schedules and preferences. Ryan said that sounded so obvious, but he'd never approached marriage that way. I moved away from the window before they could see me listening. During my next therapy session with Michelle, she asked if I'd seen genuine change or just temporary performance anxiety, and I had to think carefully about the difference. The effort seemed real because Ryan was maintaining them consistently over weeks now, not just doing things when he thought I was watching, but I was scared to trust it because I didn't want to go back to being taken for granted. Michelle asked what would help me feel safer trusting again, and I realized I needed him to acknowledge the emotional labor, not just do the tasks. Anyone could learn to do laundry and clean a bathroom. What I needed was for him to understand all the invisible work I'd been doing for years, the mental load of remembering and planning and managing everything. Michelle nodded and said that was a reasonable need, and she suggested I talk to Ryan about it directly. That night, I told Ryan we needed to talk about the invisible work I'd been doing beyond just chores. He looked confused at first, his forehead wrinkling like he didn't understand what I meant. I started listing examples, remembering his mother's birthday and buying the card and gift, managing his family relationships and keeping track of who needed a phone call or visit, scheduling doctor appointments and keeping our medical records organized, tracking when bills were due and making sure they got paid on time, planning meals for the week and making sure we had groceries, remembering our friends' kids' names and ages so we could ask about them, keeping track of when the car needed oil changes and tire rotations, noticing when we were running low on household supplies before we actually ran out. He was genuinely shocked as I kept talking, his mouth hanging open like he'd never considered any of this. He admitted he thought these things just happened automatically, like the house had some kind of magic system that kept everything running. I told him that system was me, spending mental energy every single day tracking and planning and remembering so he didn't have to think about any of it. Ryan asked me to show him how to share this mental load because he wanted to learn. He got his phone and opened the calendar app, and we spent the evening going through everything I tracked mentally. Birthdays for both our families, anniversaries for relatives, doctor appointments, dentist checkups, car maintenance schedules, bill due dates, subscription renewals, when to replace air filters, when to schedule furnace service. He was overwhelmed by how much I'd been juggling invisibly, typing everything into the calendar with shaking hands. He kept saying he had no idea, that he'd just assumed I liked remembering this stuff, or that it wasn't hard for me. I explained that it was hard, that it took constant mental energy, and that I'd been doing it alone for 7 years while he enjoyed not having to think about any of it. I saw real understanding dawn in his eyes, this look of horror at what he'd been blind to. 3 weeks after Dorothy's visit, my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. She asked to speak to me privately, and I walked into the bedroom and closed the door. Dorothy said she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to check on me. She told me she meant what she said about me deserving better, and that if Ryan wasn't showing real sustained change, I shouldn't stay out of obligation. I appreciated her honesty and told her I was watching carefully to see if the growth continued. She asked specific questions about what he was doing, how consistently he was maintaining the efforts, whether he was getting defensive or making excuses. I answered honestly that he seemed to be genuinely trying, and that the changes had been consistent for weeks now. She said that was good, but to keep watching because some men could fake it for a while before sliding back. I promised her I would, and she made me promise to call her if I needed support or wanted to leave. The conversation made me feel protected in a way my own mother never had. I ended the call with Dorothy and set my phone down on the nightstand. Ryan was standing in the doorway when I turned around, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly at his sides. He asked if I was planning to leave him, his voice barely above a whisper. I sat on the edge of the bed and told him honestly that I hadn't decided yet, because I needed to see if this change was real or just temporary panic. He looked like I'd punched him in the stomach, his shoulders sagging as he leaned against the doorframe. I explained that I had to know if he was actually growing as a person or just performing because his mother scared him into it. He nodded slowly and said he understood, that he'd keep proving himself for as long as it took. I watched him walk back down the hallway with his head down, and part of me felt bad for being so blunt, while another part knew I had to protect myself. The next morning, I woke up to find the bathroom stocked with fresh toilet paper rolls under the sink, something I'd always handled before without him noticing we were running low. Over the next few days, I noticed more small things that showed he was paying attention to our home in ways he never had before. The trash went out before it overflowed, the recycling got sorted properly, the dish soap got replaced before the bottle ran completely empty. These weren't big dramatic gestures, but they meant something because they showed he was actually looking at his surroundings instead of walking through life blind to everything I'd been managing. I didn't praise him for doing basic adult tasks, but I did acknowledge the effort when he asked if I'd noticed. He looked relieved when I said yes, like he'd been worried I wouldn't see the small changes he was making. A week later, my friend Isla called and invited both of us to dinner at her place, saying she wanted to see how we were doing. I accepted because I knew she'd be honest with me about what she observed, and because I was curious to see how Ryan would act around a couple who actually functioned as equals. We showed up on Saturday evening with a bottle of wine, and Isla greeted us at the door with her usual warmth. Her husband was in the kitchen finishing dinner, and I watched Ryan's face as he saw a man cooking while his wife entertained guests. We sat down in their living room, and Isla asked how things were going, her eyes moving between us with obvious concern. Ryan answered first, explaining that he'd been learning a lot about running a household and being a real partner. Isla's husband came out with appetizers, and Ryan immediately started asking him questions about how they divided up their household tasks. I sat back and listened as they talked about their system for grocery shopping, meal planning, and cleaning schedules. Ryan was genuinely engaged, taking mental notes and asking follow-up questions about how they made decisions together. Isla caught my eye and raised her eyebrows slightly, and I could tell she was cautiously impressed but still skeptical. After dinner, while the men cleaned up the kitchen together, Isla pulled me aside on the back porch and told me she could see Ryan was trying, but warned me not to let him slide back into old patterns once the fear wore off. I appreciated her honesty and told her I was watching carefully for any signs that his effort was fading. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me for holding my ground instead of just accepting his apologies and moving on. The drive home was quiet, but not uncomfortable, and I could tell Ryan was thinking about everything he'd learned from watching Isla's husband. A few days later, Ryan came home from work and found me in the living room reading. He sat down across from me and said he'd been thinking about us going to couples therapy together because he wanted professional help understanding how to be a better partner. I was genuinely surprised that he'd suggested it first instead of me having to drag him there. I asked if he was serious about therapy or if this was another temporary gesture, and he pulled out his phone to show me he'd already researched therapists in our area. He'd made a list of 3 highly recommended marriage counselors and asked if I'd look at their profiles with him. I agreed because suggesting therapy showed he understood this was bigger than just doing chores and following a task list. We spent the evening reading reviews and looking at credentials and eventually settled on Nathaniel Guerra, who specialized in partnership dynamics and had excellent ratings. Ryan called the next morning and scheduled our first appointment for the following week. The days before our first session felt heavy with anticipation, like we were about to open a door we couldn't close again. When the appointment day arrived, we drove to Nathaniel's office in separate cars because we were both coming from work. The waiting room was small and calm with soft gray walls and comfortable chairs. Nathaniel came out to greet us right on time, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. His office had large windows and 2 couches facing each other with his chair positioned between them. He asked us to sit wherever we felt comfortable, and I chose one couch while Ryan sat on the other. Nathaniel started by asking us each to explain what brought us there, and I watched Ryan's face as he began describing his behavior over the past 7 years. He told Nathaniel about his comment that marriage made his life harder, about taking me for granted, about being completely unable to function when I stopped doing everything for him. His voice shook as he talked, and his face flushed with obvious shame at having to say these things out loud to a stranger. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. When Ryan finished, Nathaniel turned to him and asked why he thought his convenience had mattered more than partnership. Ryan opened his mouth to answer, closed it, then tried again. He struggled to find words that didn't sound like excuses, and I could see him working through the question in real time. Nathaniel pressed further, asking if Ryan had considered what his wife was sacrificing while he enjoyed his freedom from responsibility. Ryan admitted he hadn't thought about it that way, that he'd been completely blind to what I was giving up to make his life easier. What surprised me most was that he didn't get defensive or try to justify his behavior. He just sat there taking the hard questions and admitting he had no good answers. Nathaniel asked me to share my perspective, and I explained how exhausting it had been to carry the entire mental and emotional load of our marriage alone. I described the years of feeling invisible and unappreciated, of being treated like a service provider instead of a partner. Nathaniel nodded and said he was hearing 2 people who'd been living in completely different marriages, one person doing all the work, while the other coasted along oblivious. He gave us homework before we left, instructing each of us to write down what we needed from the marriage and what we were willing to give. He said we weren't allowed to discuss it with each other until our next session, that we each needed to think independently about what we actually wanted. I spent the next several days thinking about his assignment, sitting with my notebook and trying to separate what I truly needed from what I'd been accepting. I wrote down respect and appreciation at the top of my needs list, then added true partnership where both people contributed equally. I realized as I wrote that I'd been settling for so much less than a real marriage, accepting crumbs of attention and calling it love. My list of what I was willing to give included emotional support, companionship, and shared responsibility, but I also wrote down that I needed those things reciprocated. When our next session arrived, I felt nervous about sharing what I'd written, worried that our lists would be so different we'd realize we wanted completely incompatible things. Nathaniel had us read our lists out loud, and I went first because Ryan looked terrified. My list focused on emotional needs like respect, appreciation, and genuine partnership that went beyond just completing tasks. When Ryan read his list, I was struck by how different it was from mine. His needs were mostly about emotional support and companionship, things I'd been providing all along while getting nothing back. His list of what he'd give included all the practical tasks he'd been avoiding like cooking, cleaning, laundry, and household management. Nathaniel pointed out that we'd been operating in completely different frameworks, that I'd been asking for emotional partnership while Ryan had been focused on task distribution. He explained that both were important, but that we'd been talking past each other because we weren't even discussing the same things. Nathaniel spent the rest of the session explaining concepts like emotional labor and mental load, using specific examples from our marriage that made Ryan physically wince. He described how I'd been tracking everything from his mother's birthday to the car's oil change schedule while Ryan walked through life assuming these things just happened magically. He talked about the invisible work of noticing what needs to be done, planning how to do it, and remembering to follow through. Ryan's face grew more horrified with each example as he recognized his own behavior in everything Nathaniel described. Before we left, Nathaniel assigned us new homework. He gave Ryan a list of articles and books about partnership equity and told him to read them carefully. He gave me resources about rebuilding trust after it's been broken and how to know if someone's change is genuine. We both had reading to do that went much deeper than just figuring out who should wash the dishes. A few days later, Ryan found me in the kitchen making dinner and asked if we could talk. I turned down the stove and gave him my attention. He said he'd finished reading the materials Nathaniel assigned, and that he finally understood why his comment about marriage making life harder had been so devastating. He explained that he could see now he'd been treating our partnership like a service he was receiving, rather than a relationship he was building with another person. I listened as he talked about the concept of unpaid labor, and how he'd been benefiting from my work for years without acknowledging or appreciating it. He said the articles had used the exact same examples from our life, and it had made him sick to see his behavior described as a common pattern of entitled husbands. I told him that understanding was good, but sustained change over time was what actually mattered. He nodded and said he knew that he wasn't expecting me to forgive him just because he'd read some articles and had a few realizations. During the same time period, I noticed I was sleeping better at night and feeling less anxious during the day. The constant background stress of managing everything alone had lifted enough that I could actually relax. The mental space that opened up when I wasn't tracking every detail of our household by myself was surprising and a little overwhelming. I hadn't realized how exhausted I'd been for years, how much energy it took to be the only person holding our life together. In my next individual therapy session with Michelle, I told her about the changes, and she helped me see that I'd been so busy compensating for Ryan that I'd completely lost track of my own needs. She asked what I wanted to do with all this newfound mental energy, and I realized I had no idea because I'd forgotten what it felt like to have space for myself. Michelle helped me understand that reclaiming mental space was just the beginning, and that I needed to figure out what I actually wanted from my life and my marriage. I started keeping a journal where I wrote down things I'd always wanted to do, but never had time for because I was too busy managing Ryan's life alongside my own. The list grew longer each day and included things like taking a pottery class, learning to speak Spanish, joining a book club, traveling to places Ryan had never wanted to visit. Looking at that list made me realize how much of myself I'd given up without even noticing it happening over 7 years. Ryan's phone rang on speaker one evening while he was washing dishes, and Dorothy's voice filled the kitchen asking him detailed questions about what he'd accomplished that week. She asked if he'd remembered to clean the bathroom, if he'd done meal prep for the upcoming week, if he'd scheduled the car's oil change. Ryan answered each question while scrubbing a pan, his voice tired but patient as he explained what he'd learned and what he was still working on. Dorothy told him she was proud of his efforts, but reminded him that he had years of taking me for granted to make up for, and that the work needed to continue long after the initial shame wore off. I stood in the doorway listening to her hold him accountable, and I felt grateful that she called every week to check on his progress, because it meant he couldn't just slide back into old patterns when things got comfortable again. Ryan came to me about 6 weeks after everything had fallen apart and asked if I'd be free on Friday night because he wanted to take me somewhere. I asked what he had in mind, and he said it was a surprise, but that he'd handled all the planning and arrangements. Friday arrived, and Ryan drove us to a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try months ago, a place he'd clearly researched and called ahead to make reservations for. The evening was nice with good food and easy conversation, and I could see how much effort he'd put into planning something social without my input or management for the first time in our entire marriage. But I kept my guard up throughout dinner because I was scared that if I let myself fully enjoy this moment, I'd be setting myself up for disappointment when he stopped trying. We sat in Nathaniel's office the following week for our regular therapy session, and he asked me directly what would help me feel safer being vulnerable with Ryan again. I told him honestly that I was scared because every time I'd softened in the past, Ryan had taken it as permission to stop trying, and I'd ended up carrying everything alone again. Ryan immediately promised he wouldn't let that happen this time, but Nathaniel stopped him and pointed out that promises weren't enough when trust had been broken this badly. He said rebuilding trust required consistent action over time, not just words or good intentions. We spent the rest of the session discussing concrete ways Ryan could demonstrate reliability, things like maintaining his household contributions for months without backsliding, continuing to notice, and address tasks without reminders and checking in regularly about how I was feeling instead of assuming everything was fine. Ryan started checking in with me before making plans with his friends, and at first I thought he was asking permission like a child. But he explained that he wasn't asking if he could go out. He was coordinating schedules to make sure we were both managing our time fairly, and that neither of us was stuck handling everything while the other had fun. This small shift from assuming his time was entirely his own to recognizing that we shared our lives together meant more than he probably realized. I appreciated being considered instead of being an afterthought, and I told him so because I wanted to acknowledge when he got things right. I had a particularly rough day at work dealing with a difficult client who kept changing requirements and blaming me for delays I couldn't control. I came home exhausted and frustrated, ready to handle dinner and evening tasks like I always did. But Ryan took one look at my face and told me to sit down while he handled everything. He ordered takeout from my favorite Thai place, ran me a bath with the fancy bath salts I kept for special occasions, and took care of all the evening chores so I could decompress. It was the kind of care I used to provide for him constantly during his bad days, and receiving it felt strange and foreign but deeply appreciated. I teared up a little while soaking in the tub, which surprised both of us when he checked on me and saw my face. Nathaniel asked during our next therapy session if we were ready to discuss intimacy and reconnection, and I immediately tensed up in my chair because I hadn't wanted to be physically close to Ryan while feeling so hurt and angry. Ryan admitted he'd been afraid to initiate anything because he didn't want to pressure me or make me uncomfortable. We had an honest conversation about rebuilding physical intimacy slowly, and only when I felt ready, and Nathaniel helped us understand that emotional safety had to come before physical closeness. He suggested we start with small gestures like holding hands or sitting close together while watching television, and that we let things progress naturally instead of forcing reconnection before we were both ready. Ryan told me one evening that he'd been talking to Tony and his other friends about marriage and partnership in ways he never had before. He said he'd actually started asking them how they showed appreciation for their partners and what they did to maintain equal partnerships. Tony had apparently told him bluntly that he'd been acting like a bachelor who happened to live with a woman instead of like a husband who'd chosen a life partner. Ryan said hearing it from his friends made it sink in differently than hearing the same thing from me or his mother, and that sometimes external validation helped him see his behavior more clearly. I came home about 2 months after everything had fallen apart to find Ryan exhausted and proud in our spotlessly clean house. He'd deep cleaned every room without being asked, including tasks I'd never expected him to notice, like wiping down baseboards and cleaning behind appliances. The house looked better than it had in years, and I could see the physical toll the work had taken on him. I realized he was starting to take genuine ownership of our shared space in a way he never had before, treating it like his responsibility instead of something that just magically stayed clean. I thanked him genuinely for the first time in weeks, and his face lit up with relief and happiness at receiving my appreciation. Nathaniel asked us each to describe the other's growth during our next therapy session, and I listened as Ryan articulated how I'd maintained firm boundaries while still giving him space to change. He described me as strong and fair and said he was grateful I hadn't just left like he probably deserved after the way he'd treated me. Hearing him recognize my strength made me emotional because it showed he finally understood what it had taken for me to hold my ground. I described Ryan as genuinely trying to unlearn decades of entitlement, and I acknowledged that the work he was doing was harder than most people realized, because it required completely reshaping how he saw himself and our relationship. Ryan's coworker Helen mentioned to him at work that he seemed different lately, more present and less stressed, and she asked what had changed in his life. He told her honestly about the marriage crisis and what he was learning about partnership and emotional labor. Helen told him later that his willingness to be vulnerable and admit he'd been wrong impressed her more than if he'd just quietly fixed things and pretended nothing had happened. Ryan shared this conversation with me that evening, and I appreciated that he was being open about our struggles instead of hiding them out of shame or embarrassment. I find myself watching Ryan load the dishwasher correctly without checking a tutorial on his phone, and something shifts inside me. He's been doing this for 2 months straight now, not just when I'm watching, but all the time according to the dishes that are always clean when I get home from work. The change feels less like performance and more like actual habit, which scares me because it means I might have to let my guard down. I schedule an emergency session with Michelle and tell her I'm confused about what I'm feeling. She asks me to describe the confusion, and I explain that my anger is fading, but I'm terrified that softening toward Ryan means I'm forgetting how much he hurt me. Michelle leans forward and tells me that cautious trust isn't the same as forgetting, that I can acknowledge his growth while still protecting myself from potential backsliding. She says the walls I built were necessary for survival, but I get to decide how high they stay now that the immediate danger has passed. I leave her office feeling like I have permission to feel something other than pure anger without being weak or stupid. Ryan brings up renewing our vows during dinner one evening, catching me completely off guard with a mouthful of the pasta he'd made from scratch. He explains quickly that he's not saying our marriage is fixed, or that everything is perfect, but he wants to recommit to partnership with full understanding of what that actually means this time. I swallow my food and stare at him across the table, trying to figure out if this is genuine or just another grand gesture meant to speed up my forgiveness. He sees my face and adds that he knows I'm not ready and he's not pushing. He just wanted me to know he's thinking about ways to mark this change symbolically. I tell him maybe someday when more time has passed and when I'm sure the change is permanent, not just 2 months of panic-driven effort. He nods and says that's fair, then asks if I want more pasta, and I appreciate that he doesn't push or get defensive about my hesitation. Dorothy calls the following week saying she wants to visit again, and this time Ryan actually tells me immediately, and we plan it together like adults. She arrives to a clean house with fresh sheets on the guest bed and food in the refrigerator, and I watch her eyes widen as she walks through rooms that look lived in but cared for. Ryan gives her a tour pointing out things he's learned to maintain, and she hugs him tight in the hallway. Later that evening, while Ryan is outside taking out the trash, Dorothy pulls me into the kitchen and tells me privately that she sees real growth in her son. She says she's sorry she didn't raise him better the first time around, that she'd been so focused on survival after his father left, that she'd done too much for him instead of teaching him to do for himself. I tell her it's not her fault that Ryan had to learn these lessons the hard way as a grown man, that plenty of single mothers raise capable sons, and Ryan's entitlement was his own responsibility to fix. We stand there in the kitchen bonding over our shared frustration with his previous behavior, and Dorothy squeezes my hand saying she's glad he has me, because she's not sure he would have changed without hitting rock bottom. The next night during Dorothy's visit, Ryan cooks dinner for all three of us using recipes he's actually mastered over the past 2 months, instead of just following along with tutorials. He moves around the kitchen with real confidence now, knowing where everything is and how long things take without constantly checking his phone. Dorothy watches him plate the food, and her eyes get watery as she realizes her 35-year-old son has finally learned to feed himself and others. She tells him she's proud of the man he's becoming, and that his father's choice to abandon them doesn't have to define who Ryan turns out to be. Ryan sets down the serving spoon and thanks her for the tough love that started this whole transformation, saying he needed someone to show him how much like his father he was acting. They hug in front of the stove, and I feel something crack open in my chest watching them. 3 months after Ryan said marrying me made his life harder, we have our most honest conversation yet about whether our marriage can actually survive this. We're sitting on the back porch after Dorothy has gone to bed, and I tell him I see his efforts and growth, but I'm still hurt by how little he valued me before. I explain that I can't just forget 7 years of being taken for granted even if the past 2 months have been different. Ryan doesn't interrupt or make excuses. He just listens with his hands folded in his lap. When I finish, he acknowledges that my hurt is completely fair, and that he can't undo the years of treating me like unpaid help instead of a chosen partner. He says he hopes I'll give him the chance to build something better going forward, but he understands if the damage is too deep to repair. I don't give him an answer that night because I genuinely don't know yet, but I appreciate that he's not demanding immediate forgiveness or resolution. At our next therapy session, Nathaniel asks us what our marriage would look like if we decide to stay together, and we spend the full hour defining new terms of partnership. We discuss equal division of labor with both of us tracking and managing household tasks instead of it all falling on me. We talk about sharing the mental load of remembering dates and managing schedules and planning ahead for life events. We agree on mutual appreciation where both of us acknowledge what the other contributes instead of taking it for granted. Ryan suggests regular check-ins to prevent sliding back into old patterns, and I add that we need quarterly reviews of our household systems to make sure they're still working. Nathaniel helps us create a written agreement about household management that we'll revisit every 3 months, and having it in writing makes it feel more real and accountable. We both sign the document at the end of the session, and Nathaniel keeps a copy in our file. The following week, I tell Ryan I'm willing to actively work on rebuilding our marriage instead of just watching him try to fix things alone, and his whole face lights up with relief. I explain that this doesn't mean everything is fine or that I'm not still hurt, but I'm ready to participate in the repair process instead of staying on the sidelines. We agree to keep going to therapy weekly, maintain all our new household systems without getting lazy, and communicate honestly about needs and resentments before they build up into explosions. It feels like we're starting over in some ways, but with a much better foundation than we had the first time around. Ryan reaches for my hand across the couch, and I let him take it, and we sit there quietly for a while just holding hands like we used to when we first started dating. Ryan plans a weekend trip for us to reconnect away from the house and all its associations with our crisis, booking a small cabin in the mountains without asking me to help coordinate anything. We drive up on a Friday afternoon, and for the first time in months, I let myself relax around him instead of staying tense and guarded. We spend the weekend talking about things other than our marriage problems, laughing at stupid jokes and remembering why we fell in love 7 years ago. On Saturday night, we're sitting by the fireplace, and he tells me he'd forgotten how much he genuinely likes me as a person, beyond just being married to me. I realize I'd forgotten that too, that I'd been so focused on his failures as a partner that I'd stopped seeing the person I'd chosen. The physical intimacy comes naturally that night when I finally feel safe with him again, not forced or obligated, but genuinely wanted on both sides. We come home Sunday evening to our shared space that now feels more like a true partnership than it ever did before. Ryan unpacks both our bags and starts a load of laundry without being asked while I check the mail and water the plants. We move around each other in the house with new awareness of how we're both contributing, instead of one person doing everything while the other person ignores it. Over the next week, Ryan maintains his efforts with household tasks, and I find myself re-engaging with our life together instead of emotionally withdrawing. We're both doing the work of rebuilding, and it feels more balanced than our marriage ever was in the previous 7 years. I catch myself smiling at him across the dinner table one night and realize I'm not faking it or forcing it. I'm actually happy. At our next therapy session, Nathaniel notes the visible shift in our dynamic before we even sit down and asks what changed. We explain that the weekend away helped us reconnect emotionally, and remember we actually like each other, and that we're both committed to the ongoing work of partnership now, instead of just Ryan trying to fix his mistakes. Nathaniel reminds us that growth isn't linear, and that we'll have setbacks and hard days where old patterns try to resurface. He says the foundation we're building now is much stronger than what we had before, because it's based on honest communication and mutual effort, instead of unexamined assumptions and gendered expectations. We schedule our next appointment for 2 weeks out instead of 1 week, and leaving the office feels like a small graduation. 4 months after everything fell apart, Ryan's brother and his wife came for dinner. I watched them walk through our house, their eyes taking in the clean counters, the organized living room, the fresh flowers on the table. Ryan's sister-in-law kept glancing between us like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She pulled me aside while Ryan and his brother were in the kitchen getting drinks. She asked what happened because Ryan seemed like a completely different person. I told her honestly that he had to learn what partnership actually means. She nodded slowly and said she wished her husband would have a similar awakening. She explained that her husband still expected her to handle everything at home while working full-time. I felt sad for her, but also grateful that Ryan had finally understood before it was too late for us. Ryan started mentoring a younger guy at work named Anthony who was getting married soon. Anthony came over for dinner one night, and Ryan talked to him honestly about the mistakes he had made. He explained how he had taken me for granted and treated partnership like a burden. Anthony listened carefully and asked questions about how Ryan changed his thinking. Hearing Ryan share these lessons with someone else showed me he had internalized the growth. He wasn't just performing it for my benefit anymore. The mentorship seemed to reinforce his own commitment to change. After Anthony left, Ryan told me that explaining his mistakes to someone else made him realize how far he had come. He said he never wanted to go back to being that person who complained about having to consider his wife. I realized one day while doing dishes together that I was genuinely happy in my marriage for the first time in years. Not just content or resigned, but actually happy. The partnership we were building felt fair and respectful in ways our marriage never was before. We moved around the kitchen in sync, him washing and me drying, talking about our days. I stopped mid-sentence and told Ryan what I was feeling. He put down the dish he was holding and turned to face me with tears in his eyes. He said that was all he had been working toward. He said making me happy again was more important than anything else. I hugged him and felt safe in his arms in a way I hadn't felt in months. During therapy, Nathaniel asked if we were ready to graduate from weekly sessions to monthly check-ins. Ryan and I looked at each other and both felt ready for that step. Nathaniel reminded us that the work doesn't stop just because therapy becomes less frequent. He said we needed to maintain our communication and accountability systems. We agreed to keep our quarterly household management reviews and regular date nights. Nathaniel told us he was proud of the progress we had made. He said most couples never do the hard work we had done. Walking out of his office that day felt like a real achievement. We were managing our marriage ourselves now instead of needing constant professional help. 5 months after the crisis started, Dorothy called to check in. I answered the phone instead of Ryan. She asked how I was really doing, not just the polite version. I told her honestly that I was cautiously optimistic about our marriage. She said she was glad, but that I should never hesitate to leave if Ryan slides back into old patterns. I appreciated her ongoing support and protection of me. She said she would always be on my side first because I had put up with too much for too long. I thanked her for the tough love that started this whole transformation. Without her showing up and teaching Ryan basic life skills, we probably would have gotten divorced. She laughed and said she was glad her visit accomplished something good even if it was painful at the time. Ryan and I hosted a dinner party with Isla and her husband, Tony and his girlfriend, and Helen and her partner. I watched Ryan interact as a true partner throughout the evening. He coordinated the meal with me, checking in about timing and tasks. He engaged equally with our guests, asking questions and contributing to conversations. He cleaned up afterward without prompting, loading the dishwasher while I put away leftovers. Our friends noticed the change. Isla pulled me aside in the kitchen and said we seemed so much better together. Tony told Ryan he was impressed with how much he had grown up. Helen said she could see the difference in how we interacted now. The evening felt like a celebration of our new partnership. I suggested to Ryan that we take a cooking class together as a fun way to keep building our partnership. He agreed right away and seemed excited about it. We signed up for a 6-week series at the community center. Every Tuesday night, we learned new recipes and techniques together. The teacher showed us how to make pasta from scratch, how to properly season meat, how to balance flavors. Ryan took notes and asked questions. We practiced at home between classes, trying out what we learned. Cooking together became something we both looked forward to instead of a chore I handled alone. We laughed when things went wrong and celebrated when dishes turned out well. The collaborative experience felt joyful instead of stressful. 6 months after everything changed, we had our quarterly household management review. We sat down with our shared calendar and task list to see how we were doing. Ryan had kept up with his tasks consistently. We had both managed the mental load together. Our communication had stayed honest and regular. The review felt like a celebration of sustained change rather than a check on potential backsliding. Ryan pointed out that the house ran smoothly now without either of us feeling overwhelmed. I agreed and said I felt like we were actually partners instead of roommates or parent and child. We decided to keep the quarterly reviews because they helped us stay on track. The structure gave us a regular time to address small issues before they became big problems. During our monthly therapy session, Nathaniel asked us to reflect on the past 6 months and what we had learned. Ryan talked about unlearning entitlement and learning gratitude. He explained how he used to think his comfort was more important than partnership. Now he understood that marriage meant considering another person in every decision. I discussed rebuilding trust and advocating for my needs. I explained how I had learned to speak up instead of just doing everything myself. We both acknowledged that our marriage was better now than it ever was before the crisis. Nathaniel smiled and said that was an unexpected gift from a painful experience. He reminded us that growth would continue and that we should stay committed to communication. Ryan told me one evening while we were folding laundry together that he was grateful I didn't leave him when I had every reason to. He said he knew how lucky he was to get this second chance. I told him I was grateful he did the hard work of actually changing, instead of just apologizing and expecting forgiveness. We agreed that we were building something worth keeping. The marriage we had now felt solid and real. It was based on mutual respect and effort instead of one person doing everything. Ryan reached over and squeezed my hand. I squeezed back and smiled at him. We finished the laundry in comfortable silence, both of us knowing we had made it through the worst and come out stronger. I walked into Michelle's office the following week and sat down in the familiar chair that had witnessed so many of my struggles over the past months. She smiled at me and asked how things were going, and I found myself saying something I hadn't expected to say. I told her I felt genuinely secure in my marriage again. The words surprised me as they came out, but they were true. Michelle leaned forward and asked me to think about what had changed to make me feel that way. I explained that Ryan's consistency over 6 months had proven the change was real, that he wasn't just performing for his mother or therapist, but actually becoming a different kind of partner. Michelle nodded and pointed out something I hadn't fully recognized. She said I wasn't just accepting Ryan's change passively, but actively participating in building our new partnership. I was setting boundaries, communicating my needs clearly, and holding him accountable when necessary. She reminded me that I'd grown through this crisis too, becoming much clearer about my worth and what I needed from a relationship. I sat with that for a moment and realized she was right. The woman who had silently done everything for 7 years without complaint was gone. I'd become someone who knew her value and wasn't afraid to advocate for herself. Our anniversary arrived a few days later, and I woke up to find Ryan already awake beside me. He handed me an envelope with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. I opened it and found a letter, several pages long, written in blue ink. He detailed everything he appreciated about me and our partnership, including specific examples of contributions he used to take for granted. He wrote about the emotional labor of managing his family relationships, remembering important dates and keeping our social calendar organized. He described the mental load of tracking household needs, planning meals, and anticipating problems before they became crises. He listed the daily acts of love he'd been blind to before, like making his coffee exactly how he liked it, picking up his favorite snacks at the store, and listening to his work frustrations even when I was exhausted from my own day. Reading his words made tears stream down my face because they showed he truly understood now what he couldn't see before. He'd finally recognized all the invisible work that had made his life run smoothly for 7 years. The letter ended with him thanking me for giving him the chance to become the husband I deserved, and promising to never take me for granted again. That evening, Ryan took me to the restaurant where we'd had our first date 7 years ago. He'd made the reservation weeks in advance and coordinated everything without my involvement. The table was set with candles and flowers he'd ordered specially. We ordered our meals and talked about how different this anniversary felt from the last one, when he'd forgotten our reservation entirely, and sparked the crisis that changed everything. After dinner arrived, Ryan raised his glass and gave a toast. He thanked me for giving him the chance to become the husband I deserved all along. He said we'd built a real partnership from the ashes of our old marriage, one based on mutual respect and effort instead of one person doing everything. I raised my glass and toasted to both of us for doing the hard work of transformation and choosing each other again with full understanding. We clinked glasses and I felt something settle in my chest, a sense that we'd actually made it through to the other side. Later that night, we lay in bed talking about our future, something we hadn't done in months. Ryan turned to me and said that 7 months ago he'd told me marrying me made his life harder, but now he understood how wrong he'd been. He said marriage had actually made his life better in ways he was too immature to understand before. He explained that he was a better person because of our partnership, not in spite of it. Having to consider someone else, communicate honestly, and share responsibilities had forced him to grow up in ways living alone never would have. I agreed that we were both better together now that we'd built something real and fair. Our marriage wasn't perfect and probably never would be. We still had disagreements and frustrations like any couple, but it felt genuine and balanced in ways that seemed sustainable and deeply satisfying. We'd torn down the old structure where I did everything and he coasted along oblivious. In its place, we'd built something stronger, a true partnership where we both contributed and both benefited. I fell asleep that night feeling genuinely happy about my marriage for the first time in years, maybe ever.